This section is about garment dye, and garment dye is where they dye the shirt after it's been sewn into a t-shirt. In contrast to piece dyeing is where they dye the fabric before it's ever sewn into a t-shirt. There's a lot of fun things you can do with garment dye, and I'll show you a few examples starting from the most basic, and then we'll go to some pretty wild ones. The first dye I want to show you is called a pigment dye. And a pigment dye adds color to the t-shirt. This one's got a nice distressed, washed look to it. And here's the same pigment dye, just in another color. And here's a pigment dye with a really saturated indigo blue. Dip dye is one of my favorite kinds of dye. And it's just where they dip one end of the shirt into a vat of dye. And they let the dye seep up the shirt. And it creates a natural gradient effect. And here's another dip dye, and you can see that they screen printed after the dip dye. The most well-known garment dye is a tie-dye. And this is a very standard, well-known kind of tie-dye. I like this one. It's a little more reserved, and they have a small screen print on the chest. Here's another tie-dye with a print on the front. You can get some really nice patterns with these tie-dyes, like this one. And here's a really fun one from Native. They've done a screen print over top. And this tie-dye is really neat. It's off to the side of the shirt. Much like the wash houses, if you're getting a special garment dye, a lot of times your screen printer will send out the shirts to a dye house. And a dye house is just a business that specializes in making garment dyes. Here's a specialty dye from Mowgli. I know the guys from Mowgli do a lot of working with their dye house to come up with specialty dyes. Here's another really nice one from Mowgli. And this is a similar dye process, but it also has a screen print on top of it. This one, it looks like they applied the dye by hand with either sponges or rollers. And this is what they call a marble dye. The thing about these specialty garment dyes is you'll always get a different result, and each t-shirt will be completely different, which I think adds to the value of that t-shirt.